always, we'll ask that if you kindly mute your microphone during the talk to be respectful of our speaker and to keep the flow of the discussion going. However, if you do have a question in regards to the book that we are talking about at that time, please put your question in the chat box, and we will ensure to ask Dr. Hoberman the question to make sure that the discussion continues as scheduled. We also are going to have a question and answer at the end of our discussion, where you will be permitted to ask a question to either person of Intellect U Well or Dr. Hoberman himself. Okay. We are going to do a brief introduction with Dr. Hoberman, and then we're going to follow the books Darwin's Athletes first, followed by Black and Blue, and then lastly Dopers in Uniform, followed by our question and answer. Okay. Okay, let's go ahead and get this started. Well, welcome, Dr. Hoberman. Thank you for joining us on this Sunday afternoon. How are you, sir?
Fine, thank you. And first of all, I want to thank Ms. Stansel for her introduction, and I want to thank Mr. Stansel and all of his colleagues for the honor of meeting with you today and talking about books that have occupied a big part of my life and will never stop occupying a big part of my life, because they deal with important issues that concern us all.
Thank you, sir. And I must say that when James asked me to moderate today's discussion, I just dove into researching some of your works, and then like listening to some previous podcast interviews and things of that nature about everything. So I'm very excited to ask you some questions here. So let's get started. Let's establish some similarities here. Okay, where are you from, and where did you attend college?
I'm a Northeasterner. I was born in Boston, grew up outside of New Haven, Connecticut, and out in a segregated suburb of New York City. I think it's important to mention that, because the degree to which everyone has a racialized identity has become an increasingly acknowledged topic that is simply relevant to understanding race relations and racial imbalances of power in the United States. So I'm a Northeasterner. I went to college outside of Philadelphia, a small college named Haverford, liberal arts college, a Quaker college. And there were only 100 people in each class, and I got to hang out with a lot of smart people.
Okay. Okay, cool. And can you talk a little bit about your path in academic research? How does one develop a desire or a passion to go in that field? And also, if you wouldn't mind talking about maybe who inspired you or mentored you into that space.
Well, that is a good and complicated question.
Okay.
My father was an important intellectual mentor in this respect. He was an MD, PhD. He spent most of his life doing biochemical research. He also spent 20 years later in his career being a doctor. He activated his MD. He was a devoted doctor. I really absorbed the dignity and the decency and the generosity of that part of the medical profession from my father as an example. The funny story, you talk about intellectual formation. When I was 11 years old, he said to me, "I don't care what you do, just so long as you're a scholar." Very broad-minded approach. The point is that I grew up in an extended family where getting a PhD was almost a requirement. All of my close relatives, either by marriage or by relation, almost all of them have PhDs. So that I grew up in that sort of an ethos where intellectual curiosity, the appropriateness of intellectual curiosity was just taken for granted. And, you know, I mean, extending this farther outside my own life, which had this enormous advantage that that this was the world I was used to, that these were the expectations that were familiar to me. That when I talk with students who have not inherited, and it is an inheritance, this sort of an ethos, I say, look, you know, what's important is intellectual curiosity. You know, it's that little engine inside you, and you should do what really interests you, what even fascinates you, come what may. Because if I had told anybody, you know, a long time ago that I was going into sports studies at a time when sports studies barely existed, they would have said, "You're out of your mind." And, you know, in a certain sense, I was out of my mind, but it was what I wanted to do, and it turned out well. You know, I had various episodes of luck along the way, but that little engine inside, you know, you want to know, okay, what has motivated me for a long time is wanting to understand how the world works and being able to describe it as accurately as possible. That's what I try to do. It doesn't matter what the topic is. I'm very interested in systems, understanding how a system works. It could be the system of medical racism, whereby societal racism is absorbed into the medical sphere and then turned into ideas that wind up being applied by doctors in clinics and hospitals. And that this is a process that has to be undone. And the book Black and Blue has the major purpose of undoing these developments within inside of medicine. But you can't undo anything unless you understand as best you can the system that is operating and that continues to operate, and that is going to allow a white-dominated medical profession, for example, to just keep on operating in much the way it is already operated, and to put the concerns of minority patients, and let's not forget the minority doctors, to the side. That this is a shameful history. I have the opportunity to teach not only undergraduates about race and medicine at the University of Texas. I co-teach a course at the UT Dell Medical School on the racial dimension of medicine. We have a lot of students. This is something medical students are catching on to. And it's very encouraging to see this generation, whether it's undergraduates who are interested in race and medicine issues, or the increasing numbers of medical students who know perfectly well that this ought to be in the standard medical curriculum. And they ought to understand why it is not in the standard medical curriculum. And that is, you know, the ignorance and frankly, I mean, the racial incompetence of the people who run just about all of the medical schools. That happens to be my opinion. But the point is, you're up against the system, whether it is ideas about racial difference that work their way into the clinic, whether it is how in the world do 120 some medical schools in a country that is multiracial with at least 40 million African Americans, you know, maybe 45 Hispanic Americans so-called. How do they get away with perpetuating a medical curriculum in 120 medical schools that does not incorporate the medical needs and the medical lives and the medical thinking and feelings of tens of millions of people who don't happen to be labeled white? That's the way. It's a system. If they didn't have a system, they couldn't continue in the way that they do. I'm also interested in the corruption of the international sports federations. That's a system. I mean, these are grifters and opportunists and the occasional criminal who have it down to an art. They know how to run global sport in their own interest and disregard the kinds of things that most people care about. It's a system. They've created the system. They've mastered the system. They exploit the system. So if you want to ask me, you know, what pushes me, it is wanting to understand systems out there in the real world that enable a lot of people to misbehave and to perpetuate injustices of various kinds.
Okay. Yeah, your passion definitely shines through in the way you deliver, you know, these remarks. In talking about systems, beginning with the end in mind is one core value that I personally have. Um, begin with the end in mind because it kind of layers your steps, right? So if someone wants to follow in your footsteps, you know, it seems like you had a very your whole environment was academic pursuit of excellence. So if someone doesn't come from that world, how would you advise them to go about becoming that individual who seeks the knowledge in an academic intellectual?
To follow what interests them.
Okay.
Um, you know, I just read the obituary of one of my college classmates. His mother was a seamstress. And then you read that one of the things that Joe accomplished later in life was pioneering work on allostatic load, which is just a fancy term for stress that has negative medical consequences. I didn't know that Joe Iyer was a pioneer thinking in medicine in this regard. But, you know, he came from a very modest family so far as, you know, academics, and I'm sure his mother as a seamstress did not have a lot of money. I mean, there's so much talent out there. I mean, I see this tremendous diversity of students, say, at the University of Texas. And over the last 10, 15 years, I mean, diversity in the sense of race and ethnicity has just skyrocketed. And it's great. I have classes there. Everybody is there. And it's, yes, it is an advantage to have a highly educated parents who are going to motivate you, or it can be. There are probably highly educated parents who aren't so good for their children, but that's another matter. The point is that intellectual curiosity and fascination with understanding the way things work is not limited to one class or one group of people who have benefited from, you know, special preparation. You know, that's called a head start. But there are a lot of people who run very good races who didn't have that sort of head start at the beginning.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And, you know, I think programs like this, Intellect U Well, and seeking out those individuals who might be able to help them is definitely a great first step as well. That curiosity, you know, that curiosity is really what motivates individuals to really seek to find that information. So, you know, well said. Now, in the event that any of our participants today or anyone who listens to this in the future want to contact you about your work, or possibly, you know, getting more information about you as an individual or about your academic research, how best can they do that?
Just go on to Google and put my name next to the University of Texas, and it's over. You're all available.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. With your impressive resume in terms of all the projects that you've done thus far, are you working on anything new? Is there anything that's piquing your interest now or your curiosity at this time?
Yeah, I'm seriously into 2 book projects right now, and they developed out of stuff that I've done in recent years. One is a study of the so-called Moynihan Report of 1965. This for people older than a certain number, you will recognize the Moynihan report. This was he was a government functionary at this point. This was the report on the so-called Negro family. And this was the report that launched the career of the black family pathology image into the stratosphere. It has never come down. So he didn't mean that to happen, but that is what happened. The book is all about that report and demonstrating that he of course was white. He had a high position in President Johnson's labor secretary office. He was instantly labeled a white expert on race relations and on black people in particular. And what the book demonstrates is that he had no such expertise, but that the political circumstances required that he be instantly and in a very public manner be acknowledged as the great white expert on black people. And that's what happened in this particular book is going to explain the fraudulence of his authority. And let me point out that the invention of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who went on to a great career as a senator and ambassador to India and all that, he was a distinguished man. His knowledge of race and race relations was minuscule, and he got away with it because he was a big shot in a variety of ways. But one of the reasons I think this is a worthwhile project is that when you go back to the middle of the 60s, the Moynihan report comes out in the summer of 65, and then you get huge volumes of commentary from black commentators, white commentators. One of the observations you see over and over again from black intellectuals like Ralph Ellison, for example, or Albert Murray, who is now being recognized as the important African-American writer he is the domination of the whole discussion of race by white people. I mean, white men, to put it bluntly. This is the 1960s. And not only that, Ralph Ellison and Albert Murray and others had real doubts about the expertise of these white men who were being accorded all sorts of attention, and having, expertise ascribed to them and all of this. That what was happening was that you had the creation of intellectual / academic careers of white men, I can't remember a woman among them, who are crowned as race experts. And this is the imbalance of power between the magnitude of the white voice that is pronouncing upon, who black people are and what they can do and what should be done for them and what should not be done for them. The authority of these people, and including people at Harvard, which is a name brand, the authority of these people and the value of their intellectual products is simply taken for granted because they have high positions and because they're white. And so that my sense is that telling the truth about the real lack of credentials of the famous Daniel Patrick Moynihan is a way to make a larger point about the accretion of intellectual power and authority at this critical time in the 60s. From a race standpoint, it was hot, 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 and things were happening, and people were either achieving positions or not achieving positions. And what you see is a lot of accomplished black intellectuals have been pushed to the side because they don't have the positions, they don't have the connections. Nobody's at Harvard. I mean, that's the way the sociology of knowledge and the politics of knowledge and the politics of race knowledge work. You really have to get some power. Now, in the 60s, this was, occasionally possible just through raw talent. I mean, James Baldwin is the great example. James Baldwin, one of the great American essayists of all time. His stuff is fantastic. It's 60 years ago almost since The Fire Next Time came out, and it should be read by everybody today. Mr. Stansel was talking about the continuing relevance of say, discussions around the three books we're talking about. Well, James Baldwin ought to be read by everybody, because he was trying to wake people up. I mean, his project, in a way, was trying to wake up white America. And I don't think it's too much to say that exactly the same thing is happening today, 60 years later. One of the ways I see the significance of the Black Lives Matter movement that I guess comes out of 2014 is they're trying to wake America up to certain historical racial realities. So in that sense, now 60 years later, of course, you have a wealth of high profile African-American intellectuals. It wasn't that way back in the 1960s. These people had to fight for attention. So the racial politics of all of this is in the book that I mentioned. The other book I'm working on is about the professional lives of Black doctors, what they go through. And it's a very under-attended subject, let's put it that way. In recent years, well, over the past 20 years, certainly over the past 5 or 10 years, the medical publications that are devoted to the medical predicaments and sufferings of Black patients in the American medical system, there's a large volume of that now. And what we call racial health disparities, which should be seen more as racial treatment disparities. This is not just a process of nature. This is a lot of people in the system making decisions about whether this patient is going to get that kidney transplant or whether that patient is going to get that kidney transplant, just to choose one of many examples. But my point is that, yeah, there is attention being paid on a significant scale to the medical problems of Black people. Ironically, one of the reasons that's happening in 2020 is because of COVID-19 and the grotesque death and hospitalization disparities between Black and Hispanic people and whites. This has become so odd. The pandemic has grabbed everybody's attention to the point where medical racism is what I call it, has achieved a prominence in American public life that it simply didn't have. It was the hand of the pandemic that forced this development. And as much as I wish there had never been a pandemic, one thing it has done is to raise this particular issue. Although, I'll tell you, the issue that is getting all the attention is the fate of all these poor people who are attacked by this vicious, this multi-fanged, vicious virus. What Black medical personnel go through is not paid attention to. There are reasons for that. For one thing, it's a prestigious profession. I think there are a lot of people who assume that once you get that MD, you're fine. That's not the way race in America works. Nobody gets an exemption. And shockingly, that includes doctors and nurses of color. So this is a very important issue that I want to work out in a lot of detail in this other book.
Okay. Working in an administrative capacity for the healthcare system, that is definitely something I'm going to be looking forward to. For the participants, is there a time frame in which we would be able to see that research published?
You're asking me? Okay, the answer is don't hold your breath.
Okay.
there's a lot of work to be done.
Right.
But at any rate, thanks for asking. It's another stimulus to do it quicker rather than slower.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right, so let's go in. Let's get into the first book, Darwin's Athletes. Let's start with why. What's the why behind it? Why did you decide to write this particular book, and why did you write it the way that you did?
Let's take the first question first. Why did I write it? I can't tell you that with the same precision that I could with other books. I think it was a combination of things. First of all, this is and it's a race and sports book. All right, so the sports element was always in my life. I was tremendously interested in running when I was a kid. I ran in high school. I ran for many years. I loved running. So sport was part of my life. I think another influence was the Black Power demonstration at the 1968 Mexico City Olympic Games. That the black sports sociologist Harry Edwards really gets the credit. He was the Olympic Project for Human Rights in the late 60s. And without Harry Edwards, I don't think this would have happened. And so in a way, I think Harry Edwards bears a degree of responsibility for whatever I have or have not done in this particular field. I mean, that was an absolutely electric. Those raised fists with the black gloves on them are the single most famous photograph in Olympic history for a reason. And I was in Berkeley at the time, which was its own kind of stimulation. And I think that really had an effect on it. Then somehow I ran into, and this crosses into the medical. I remember Darwin's Athletes came out in '97. And as far as I can tell, I wrote it in 18 months, which is a record for me while teaching. I don't know how I did it, frankly. I think I was possessed, but that's the answer to your second question. The first one was in 1993, I came across an article in the Medical Anthropology Quarterly that was about racism among white nurses. And I couldn't believe it. I said to myself, that's impossible. Nurses are angels of mercy. This can't be right. Well, of course it was right. And you can see this, as one of many examples. Call it white naivete or whatever. But the fact is, we all have a lot to learn. And it's almost 30 years ago, and I still remember reading that article. I still remember my shock at the discovery that nurses could have these sorts of feelings and engage in those sorts of misbehaviors. Well, it's 30 years later, and we all know much better. We know what just about anyone is capable of. We know how much, as you were and your colleagues were pointing out, how much education is required, how much guidance is required, how much moral leadership is required so that people behave better rather than worse. But what happened was that, years before I started writing Darwin's Athletes, the medical racism thing had already grabbed me. And as a matter of fact, the second chapter in Darwin's Athletes, which is supposedly a book about race and sports, is about medical racism. That what I found was that looking into ideas about Black athletic aptitude, you had to read way back in the medical literature, you had to read way back in the physical anthropology literature. And what you find is that in order to understand the white racial imagination that goes to work on athletes, it was very productive to see the minds of doctors and physical anthropologists, you know, X decades ago, going to work on the Black human being, period, okay? Because one of the big contexts in which we all live out the race dramas of this period or previous periods is what Western civilization has imagined Black people to be. This goes back to the 16th, 15th, 16th century, the voyages of exploration. Europeans land on foreign shores and they see people of color and they don't know what to make of them, and then the whole racial hierarchy kicks in, and the result is some sort of systematic racism. I mean, this is a legacy. This is a heritage we're living with to this day. The 19th century, for example, has never ended. That's my position. The racism that develops to a very high degree during the 19th century remains a very important context for the way race is thought about in the 21st century. So I take a very kind of longitudinal historical approach to all of this and insist upon the power of the past over the present, which I think is there to be read between the lines in the Black Lives Matter message that I was referring to earlier. So, all right, to go back to your question, I mean, all of this stuff, you know, just must have mixed in my head and catalyzed the idea. Well, I had the race thinking from the medical and anthropological spheres. You know, I had this permanent interest in sport, and somehow they got together and coalesced into a determination to write this book. Now, you referred, your second question was something you said, you know, why did you write it the way you did? Well, there's two aspects to that. One, I really think I was possessed. I think that as someone who basically grown up in segregated circumstances, I think there was something inside my head that said, this is your chance to really confront the race issue. And I think that's the only reason I was able to write that book in 18 months while still working. I honestly don't know how I did it. I must have really been driven, is the word. The book, of course, becomes controversial. And so, you know, how do you feel about having written a book that a small but vocal number of Black intellectuals really objected to, and that really affected my life in a not very enjoyable way for a couple of years after. I could tell you about the personal meetings I had with some of the people who lambasted me in print, these very undramatic stories. As a matter of fact, I published, I think in 2015, a long essay analyzing what happened to that book and me after it was published. Why I did it, you know, quoting the people who were hitting me, criticizing me. It was a fascinating experience. I'll tell you, it was a painful experience. It was a fascinating experience. And just personally, I think if I hadn't gotten beat up over Darwin's athletes for a couple of years, I don't think I would be the person I am today. And I don't think that we would be having this conversation. I think what getting beat up pushed out of me was what I would simply call white guilt, which is, you know, is useful for about 15 minutes. And then you might as well start devoting that energy to something a bit more creative than presenting yourself. That's my position. So that again, I mean, it was an interesting critique. It was an ordeal, but I think it was a very instructive ordeal in a certain sense. I think it was a hugely healthy ordeal in that it toughened me up so that I could deal with race relations in the United States with purpose rather than, oh my God, you know, I'm white. What's wrong with me? Or, oh my God, I'm white. Do I have the authority to talk about, you know, this or that African American predicament, et cetera, et cetera. And here, of course, you get into the big political correctness issue, which is the difference between speaking for, in the sense of, you know, arrogating to yourself the right to speak for somebody who's different from you, which is not something I favor, as opposed to speaking about in the sense of writing about. It's studying the situations of people who are not of your background. You know, if that were not allowed, I think there's an enormous amount of literature that would never have been published. I think that would be a tragedy. And then there's, you know, speaking for in the sense of advocating for, so that, you know, when I work in the medical field, I have chosen to do a lot of advocacy for a hugely disadvantaged group of people, and those are African Americans who occupy a especially vulnerable situation. I'm connected to that. It is my deep disappointment and disapproval of the way the white medical profession handles race relations and preserves its privileges, and frankly, preserves a very high degree of segregation, including in medical education. So that's one of the reasons I work as a volunteer at that medical school. I have for 3 or 4 years. I'm a volunteer trying to persuade the people around that medical school to take racial integration seriously. And it would benefit the quality of the education. It would benefit medical care. At the end of the day, it might even benefit the people in charge.
Okay. And you discussed a little bit about some of the controversies that were created after the publishing of the book. Is there something that sticks out in your mind as far as being the most memorable part of that whole experience that you said maybe transformed you or gave you a deeper perspective on the key issues?
Well, being talked about and denounced in the kinds of terms that I was shocking. But I think that a big part of the objection to the book from, you know, a small, highly qualified group of people, because, you know, my critics are Black academics with PhDs and specialties in sports studies. It's not as if these people lack credentials. They didn't. Frankly, I have had to try to guess at what it was that made some people so angry. And frankly, I think that there is a turf issue here. I think that the whole idea of a white academic walking in there and dealing with all of this sensitive material, I think, I'm guessing that there were people who just did not take kindly to that they saw me as an interloper and as somebody who should mind his own business. More specifically, I'm guessing because the criticisms of me were curiously non-specific, shall we say. I think chapter 5, which was about how Black intellectuals, or, you know, a set of Black intellectuals have dealt with the whole race and sport issue, I think that must have made people angry, because one of the things I said was that they weren't radical enough. I think I said something like, you know, there is this temptation. It's a big temptation. I mean, you can see it to this day on, you know, a website like The Undefeated. The romance of race and sport. You know, that this is a subculture that African Americans have taken over. And in a certain sense, of course, that's true. 70% of the NFL, 80% of the NBA. And so, you know, you look at the Undefeated website, and it's a nonstop celebration of this takeover. And it's understandable. I mean, how many subcultures have our racist circumstances allowed African Americans to take over? You know, it's a limited number. So I think that, as a matter of fact, my editor told me, I remember this, he told me on the phone in the summer of '95, I guess he'd read chapter 5, he said, I can quote him, he says, "You're gonna make enemies." That's what he said. And one, I really didn't understand what he meant. And number two, I didn't care. I don't think writers should worry about that, you know, if they know or think they know what they're talking about.
Yeah, that makes sense. In terms of the book, are there a few key points that you want the audience today to possibly take another look at, or to do a deep dive into as far as the book is concerned?
You know, one of the prime motivators of that book was Professor Harry Edwards' idea that African Americans had become too interested in sports, that it had was occupying too much time, attention, and energy. I mean, he's an academic intellectual. He wanted to see a lot of interest that was invested in sports for understandable reasons. He wanted to see a lot of that energy invested outside of sports, in the area that you know, look at your organization. I mean, that's the kind of work you're doing. You're talking about intellectual development. You're talking about getting kids interested in using their minds and pursuing education, you know, through higher education. You know, first generation kids at UT or wherever it happens to be. You know, that is a great story. And I think I know that I was very much attached, and still am, to Harry Edwards' idea. And but when it came out of me, I think it was resented in a way that Harry Edwards had never been resented. I mean, that's my, you know, that's my optic, and of course it's limited. It's a little bit self-interested on my part, but that's what I think.
And I know that we in our discussion that you've alluded to the fact that, you know, some of the concepts and topics in this book are still relevant today. But I want to just, you know, come out and ask you, you know, are the topics in Darwin's Athletes still relevant today, and why do you take that stance?
Yes, I think they are relevant. I think the whole idea that the sports world is possibly too absorbing for lots of African Americans, especially young African Americans. I think that is still relevant. One of the ideas in chapter 4, the suppression of the black male action figure, is the history of the way that that white institutions would, and we're talking about men now, would not let black men assume positions of leadership. Okay? Whether it was the military or politics or certainly medicine, you know, any number of professions, college presidentships, et cetera. That and as a matter of fact, going back to the sports world, I'm not sure the black quarterback controversy is over yet. I hope it's over. But for many years, it was obvious that the people who run professional and so-called college football did not want black men playing quarterback. And nobody explained why. I think there are one or two factors. One, I think there is a sort of an IQ racism involved there. Quarterbacks are supposed to be able to think quickly on their feet. Well, I don't know. Are there a few black quarterbacks thinking quickly on their feet these days? I would say so, but this was not understood for a long time. The other aspect is it's the leadership theme, that keeping black men out of leadership positions, keeping black men out of the cockpit of airplanes. I write about that in the book. That has been a very bad racist habit of this society for a long time. And so and I don't just talk about athletes in chapter 4, because the black male action figures include a greater range of people than quarterbacks. There's military leadership, flying big airplanes, leading big institutions, important institutions of whatever kind. I think there is a special place for racial prejudice about leadership capacity in the way the Western world has thought about black people, and we're part of that world. So that's how I would respond to that.
Okay, fantastic. For the individuals who are just joining us, welcome to our discussion with Dr. John Hoberman in regards to some of his literature, Darwin's Athletes, Black and Blue, and Dopers in Uniform. I would like to remind you, if you guys do have a question for Dr. Hoberman, please type your questions in the chat box, and we will ensure to ask during a particular segment. The segment now is Darwin's Athletes. And what we're going to do now is we are going to take a short 15-minute break, and we will resume our discussion at 4:10 with Black and Blue. Okay. We'll give an opportunity for folks to stretch their legs, go to the restroom if need be, but we will be here to resume the discussion at 4:10 with Black and Blue. So we'll see you folks in just a few moments here.
Became prominent enough for Donald Trump to take offense at it. No, there's lots and lots of African-American intellectual, lawyers you see on MSNBC, et cetera. So that in that sense, the situation has changed in a very, very meaningful way. I forgot Henry Louis Gates at Harvard. I mean, it's one after the next. And so that the public sphere is now populated by a really diverse collection of major voices. And my point about the 60s was that it was completely the reverse. And that there were, first of all, there were fewer Black intellectuals with public profiles. This is many years ago. This is many college educations ago. This is many PhDs ago. This is many literary careers ago. Toni Morrison. I mean, they just keep popping into your head. So in that sense, the balance of power is in better shape than it was back in the 60s when there were formative things happening, and the people who were shaping the doctrine and the debate were just about exclusively white males.
Okay. And we have another question here in the chat as well. In relation to the leadership issue, how relevant is the Black head coach in sports contrasted with the athletes themselves being leaders?
That is a great question that I have wondered about. You know, I have a certain bias that says that I wish the prominence of the African-American professional moved out of the sports sphere into a different professional sphere. That happens to be my bias. On the other hand, this is America. This is where head coaches at big schools matter, at least to large numbers of people. This is where they get the symbolic state trooper guard when they go off the field. I mean, you know, that the head coach is a big deal. So I cannot calculate in my head what that Black head coach is worth from the standpoint of bringing credibility and credit to African Americans. I'm thinking of a couple of Black sports writers back in the mid 1930s who I write about in Darwin's Athletes. And at that point, the doctrine was that African Americans were going to improve their condition. They were going to improve their relationship with the white population by being star achievers on the football field, by being star achievers on the track, like Jesse Owens at the 1936 Olympics. I mean, there's a whole history of thinking about how much this matters. And you know, back in the 30s, you know, very, very dark days for the country in general, and African Americans for sure. The appeal of that high-profile Black athlete just must have been irresistible, because the alternative, how high-profile roles were hardly there unless you're talking about entertainment. So let's put it this way: I hope they start racially integrating the football business at both levels, and I hope that one result of that is a greater degree of comfort on the part of a lot of white people with the whole idea of Black leadership.
Wow, well said. I actually had one more question before we move over to Black and Blue. I recently watched The Last Dance, which was the Bulls documentary. And in doing my research, preparing for today's discussion, I know you mentioned in a previous podcast, I was years and years ago, about Michael Jordan's stance to refuse to endorse Harvey Gantt, and against his opponent, who was notoriously one-sided when it comes to certain issues. Now, my question to you is this: at that time in the podcast, I believe your opinion was that, you know, Michael Jordan, he was in a position to where he really couldn't advocate for those individuals because it would have affected his livelihood. But now I see players like LeBron James and teams as a whole collectively changing the names on the back of their jerseys in protest to things that are going on. Have you seen a shift of things happening from the 90s Michael Jordan era to the 2020 LeBron James era and athletes' ability to speak out?
I think in 2020 we've all seen a massive shift. And by the way, I want to make something clear about what I may not have said about Michael Jordan's refusal to endorse Harvey Gantt against, of all people, the vicious racist Jesse Helms. I never had any understanding for Michael Jordan's position. I thought it was selfish. I thought it was really weak. The line that was credited to him was, well, Republicans buy shoes too. I don't think that's much of an excuse for anybody, let alone a world famous millionaire. It's just me, but I don't think I'm alone in the opinion that he failed. And I suppose it's even conceivable that if he'd really gone all in the way LeBron and a lot of people are these days, who knows? Maybe Jesse Helms would have been kicked out of the Senate. So, but my timeline reads like this: that you have the Black Power people in 1968. That is a huge event, but the momentum is not going to be maintained. You have Muhammad Ali in the 60s, mid 60s, to I guess about the mid 70s. One of a kind, an enormous event in himself. But where's the fellowship? The follow up in the wake of Muhammad Ali. I don't see. I've been paying attention to this stuff for a long time. I just don't see it. I also know that around the world, no matter what the nationality or ethnicity or whatever, the great majority of high performance athletes are not interested in social and political action. And the reason is they are so busy keeping their edge. They are so busy trying to stay at the top of the elite athlete pile that the whole idea of investing themselves in social action, just as far as I can tell, has not made sense to about 99% of them, no matter who or where they were. 2020 is a whole new encouraging chapter. And it's amazing to think what the death of George Floyd appears to have catalyzed. It's mind-boggling. And I think that one could argue that that part of it is that professional athletes, obviously not everybody, but professional athletes who are disposed to thinking about the kind of society they live in, thinking about race relations, thinking about power, thinking about, this is enough. This is enough. There's been obviously an explosion of that during this remarkable year. And that's very encouraging. Did I read that LeBron was signing up voters by the thousands? I'm thinking of email conversations I was having with an African-American sports writer I've known for a long time, just, a year or two or three ago. And, just bantering back and forth about the, what one could call the responsibilities of millionaire athletes. And in this case, African-American millionaire athletes whose political motivations ought to be a little more intense than those of their white counterparts. And I remember sending him an email to the effect that, I will take these guys seriously when they take a fraction of their fortunes and decide we're going to start flipping elections. And that is what's happening now. It took, God forbid, it took Trump as one of the causal factors of this. But this is one of the positives or potential positives.
Interesting.
And it's real. I'll tell you, it's really, really important because, and here you have to you have to refer to the poisoning of the political atmosphere by Donald Trump. And one of the things you notice in his recent statements and those of his attorney general is that they are waging nothing less than ideological war against not just Black Lives Matter, but what Black Lives Matter represents. And that is the idea that systemic racism in the United States is a reality. Trump barely has an intellect, but he does have political instincts. He is in touch with the racist instincts of his tens of millions of admirers. And he knows that for his base, plucking the racist string is always going to work. He cannot accommodate the idea that there is systemic racism in America that needs to be dealt with. It is first of all, he doesn't have the moral standards to acknowledge it. Second of all, it's hugely politically inconvenient because he's got, 50 million people behind him who have no interest whatsoever in the humanizing of race relations in the United States. My point is that there is one of the many things that's going on right now that is of great moment is this contest in the political sphere over the question of whether or not the fact of American racism is going to be taken seriously. Meaning, is it going to, for example, be invoked in order to put in place policies that are going to help the vulnerable as opposed to hammer the vulnerable? I mean, these are the stakes. And this ideological war over whether or not racism matters exists in the United States. It's just hugely important. And I'm afraid that even if Trump leaves, we're going to be left with the residue, this poisonous residue. And that's where the whole issue of the police comes in, but we'll be getting to that later on.
Okay. Yeah, and on the topic of racism, let's do a slight pivot here. Let's talk about Black and Blue. And it talks about racism in the healthcare industry. What is medical racism?
Medical racism takes various forms at different social levels. Medical racism is, in the largest sense, is the provision of racially discriminatory care. You can demonstrate in the peer-reviewed medical literature beyond a shadow of a doubt that African-American patients in dozens of medical scenarios in a variety of medical subspecialties are getting care that is inferior to the care that is given to whites. There are hundreds of peer-reviewed articles that demonstrate this. That isn't hard to show. What is much harder to show is any sort of systemic response from organized medicine to do something about this. I don't think they are capable of this time of doing this. And I think one of the reasons they're not capable is they're not sufficiently interested, frankly. The most white doctors in this country do not think there is racial bias in medicine, let alone that they or their close colleagues are capable of practicing medicine in a racially discriminatory way. So in that sense, massive treatment inequities. It's not just that, because what you usually hear about are what are called racial health disparities, that, the prevalence of this in the Black population is higher than the prevalence of the same disorder, say, in the white population. And I think that our temptation is to say, well, that's just the way it is. This is a natural phenomenon, and accountability is really nowhere to be found. And that is the missing ingredient in medical reform of race relations in the United States. And that is actually holding individual doctors, individual administrators, individual medical school deans accountable for doing something in the face of these unequal medical scenarios. So that's the large scale. Medical racism also takes the form of the abuse of individuals. And this needs to be contextualized. I've been doing this particular stuff for like 25 years. And one of the things that still almost shocks me is the degree of abuse that is accepted and accommodated and deferred to within the medical culture, including high prestige medical schools, for example, including hospitals that are supposed to be good hospitals. The abuse of subordinates is everywhere. And those, in a way, it almost doesn't matter who the subordinate is. There's a huge amount of sexual harassment, for example, of female doctors. Stuff you wouldn't believe, but it's true. The same applies to the racist scenarios that play out in all sorts of medical venues. We are taught to assume that medicine wears a halo. It's called the halo effect. That we were all taught. I was certainly taught by the example of my father, by just the values I was swimming around in as I was developing, that there's something special about medicine. And there are special things about medicine. A few years ago, my life was saved at least twice by skilled medical people. I have nothing against medicine. Abusive behavior, that's different. That is a betrayal of the professional ethos. And the reason this happens is because there is next to no leadership in American medicine at any executive level that I am able to detect. That there is no order that comes down from the person who runs the hospital that if I get one more report of racist harassment of a doctor or a nurse or whoever, I'm going to come down like a ton of bricks, and there's going to be accountability. I don't see that happening in American medicine. There was an article published in the New England Journal of Medicine, September of 2018. It was about sexual harassment in American medical schools. And so there I am, co-teaching a course at the UT Dell Medical School. There were four women in that course at that point. We have lots more now. And published in the New England Journal, which is the most prestigious medical journal in the world. And there was a figure that any woman medical student within the University of Texas system, and there's 5 or 6 medical schools, had a 45% chance of being sexually harassed before she gets her MD. So your chances were 1 in 2. And I said to those women, you know what the dean of this medical school should do? First of all, he ought to be aware of that publication. I don't know whether he was or he wasn't. The next thing he ought to do would be to offer you protection. Because you're at a UT medical school. You've got a 1 in 2 chance of being mishandled this way between right now and when you get your MD. Of course, that didn't happen. That's what I think ought to happen. You have people way up in university administrations, especially these days, where the anti-racist wind is blowing very hard for the time being, saying zero tolerance. This elaborate planning to make sure that minority people of whatever definition are not abused. Doesn't happen in the medical world. So, and I would call that a form of medical racism. Another thing that happens, and this gets interesting, is because what if you are a physician of color, and you don't have to be African American? You know, there's lots and lots and lots of doctors in the American system now who are dark-skinned people from South Asia. I've had a ton of students in recent years. I don't even know their ultimate geographical origin. Frankly, I don't care. They're UT students. And there they are, they're in class, they're studying medical races, and they're studying this, they're studying that. I think those people enjoy protections that medical people do not. But here's what I was going to say a minute ago, that it's not just that there is interprofessional abuse. It's that there's a very interesting situation that arises when a doctor has a duty of care. You're presented with a patient, you have an obligation to take care of that patient. What if you are a darker skinned doctor? And again, you don't have to be an African American. There's plenty of darker skinned doctors who are not African Americans. As a matter of fact, they outnumber the African American doctors, only around 4%. And so the doctor shows up at the bedside, and the patient, who is going to be a white patient, starts racially abusing the black medical professional. And so you have this contest between the doctor's duty of care and the doctor's entitlement to dignity as a person, as a black person, as a medical professional who has knocked herself out in order to get into that white coat. Okay, that's a tough one. And then one of the types of reading I give to the students is these personal testimonials from, let's say, female doctors of color who have been verbally abused. And one of the things, and as a matter of fact, this is a lesson that American society in general is learning, but let's look at it on a micro scale. The amount of damage you can do to a person by directing a racist insult at that person exceeds anything I imagined. Okay? And when you blow that up to a larger scale, you are within the universe of police-civilian relationships, say, in the African American community. For the past several years, one of the things that you've seen in both the medical and the public health literature, say the past 5 years, is publication after publication documenting the emotional / mental health harm that is done to countless thousands of African Americans as the ripple effect of one incident of police brutality. Because thousands of people are going to empathize with the victim. Thousands of people are going to wonder whether that can happen to him or her. You know, the human feelings of countless thousands of people are going to be activated by this highly publicized act of brutality. And of course, for the past 10 years, there's a lot of terrible things you can watch on video. And then you can read commentaries by African Americans who say, I can't watch that video. It's simply too traumatizing. See,
Right.
the whole idea, and by the way, one of the pillars of Western racism is the idea that Black people are less complex than white people and therefore have simpler and blunter emotional lives. That the whole idea that the young Black male who looks so tough could be traumatized, you know, or could grieve, et cetera, et cetera. I think this is a brand new idea for a lot of people.
Right, right. Well, certainly, you know, medical racism is deep, has deep, very deep roots. as you alluded to. Let's talk about like the actual book. So you said with Darwin's Athletes, you said you were almost possessed in the fact that, you know, you had a full-time job and you completed the book in 18 months. How long did it take to write or compile the research, publish Black and Blue?
I don't know.
Okay.
I can tell you that my serious interest in the subject really came alive in the winter of 94, 95 when I was visiting at the University of Chicago, and they have a fabulous medical library there. And so you go up there. One of the things is I've read through centuries of medical literature in order to develop a research base. And one of the really illustrative things that happen is you go up into that medical library and you look down this long corridor. And on the right-hand side is the Journal of the American Medical Association, which probably dates from around 1860 or something like that. And then you look down the left-hand side of the same corridor and you see the Journal of the National Medical Association, which started publishing in 1917. It is the only Black-edited medical journal in America. And it celebrated its 100th birthday 3 years ago. And so there you have, you know, you've got, in a certain sense, you have a white journal on the right, extending down, 20 yards. You've got the Black journal on the left, extending down another 20 yards. And to me, that is a very telling sort of symbolic pointer to the various kinds of racial segregation that really permeate American medicine and to which very little attention is paid. I'm going to try to work that out in the second medical racism book. By the way, the number of Black authors in, it's called JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is the second highest rated journal in America. Of course, they're going to allow Black authors in there. I've been through it. There aren't a whole lot of them. You look to the left-hand side of that corridor at the African American edited journal, and it's full of everybody. That they are covering all sorts of topics, and there aren't enough Black doctors around to fill the journal. And so everybody is welcome to publish in the JNMA. And it's a good thing, or it would be a less substantial journal. If they hadn't racially integrated that journal, it would be a pretty small journal. In fact, it's a very interesting journal. And it is where you can really learn something you're never going to get from the mainstream medical literature about what it is like to live medicine as a Black person in the United States, what it is like to be a Black doctor in the United States. The best place to find out what it has been like to be a Black doctor in the United States is to just start reading the Journal of the National Medical Association and don't stop. It's appalling, it's fascinating, it's where you're going to learn. So, you see, these are, the other thing I learned looking at that corridor and evaluating the so-called mainstream journal on the right-hand side and the African American edited journal on the left-hand side was that they offer two different versions of race and medical reality, shall we say. And I had a choice to make. Either I was going to identify with the mainstream perspective on race relations in American medicine, or the quote unquote Black perspective that you can find in the JNMA and elsewhere. And it was just no contest. If you want to be in a position to describe the real world of American race relations in medicine, you had better identify with the so-called black point of view because it's just 10 times more accurate and realistic than the white one. That's, you know, that's a practical decision. You know, to the point of, you know, do you want to do good work, or do you want to do work that is flawed by the blinders that are worn by so many white doctors and that persist in the quote unquote white medical literature. So, you know, it's, and again, it's a contest for power, and it's an unequal contest for power. And here is a quantitative documentation of how unequal this contest for power is. Every journal has what's called an impact factor. How influential is it? In the case of the New England Journal of Medicine, you're looking at about 75. In the case of the Journal of the American Medical Association, you're looking at about a 55. And when I checked the other day, the number for the Journal of the National Medical Association is 1, which is staggering in a way. It tells you how little use of all of this Black medical knowledge is being made of what Black doctors know. I see that over and over again. There's a whole history of African-American doctors, sort of, you know, James Baldwin in the medical world, trying to get the attention of the white colleagues, trying to explain certain things to them, trying to help them not screw up when they're diagnosing a Black patient, for example. There's a whole history of these comments, especially with Black psychiatrists. As far as I can tell, there is a very, very small white audience for all of this expertise. That to me is a form of racial segregation.
Interesting. And would that be one of the key points that you would want to be known from reading this book?
Absolutely. If you want to understand race relations in American medicine in any sort of useful way, if you don't listen to those Black voices, those Black experts, you know, the psychiatrists, et cetera, it's hopeless. You're just going to be ignorant of a great deal of human reality. And that makes for inferior medical practice, and it certainly makes for inferior medical history if anybody is going to try to write the history of race relations in this context. Either there's a racially integrated perspective, or there's a really, really deficient perspective.
Oh, when we actually have a question here in the chat box here. As a Black woman pursuing a career in healthcare, I have experienced and extensively read about the persistence of racist medical beliefs in medicine. Based on your research and understanding of this issue, how would you suggest that Black physicians address the racial treatment disparities in healthcare in order to work towards dismantling this broken system?
Wow. That is a very good question and a very tough question. And the reason I'm calling it a tough question is because, in my observation, because there are proportionally so few African-American medical people, I don't think they collectively feel powerful enough to make prominent demands as a group. That's my observation for what it's worth. I would love to see it. I don't see much of it. I know Black doctors who are activists. They are not people in, you know, prominent institutional positions or something like that. People who simply will not shut up about what they see. of medical racism in the area of the country, the institutions they know, et cetera. But these are not people with leverage. They're not people at elite institutions. So that, I mean, what Black doctors do, some of, is to publish. You've got to publish for a variety of reasons. The question is, who is going to be listening? And what are your expectations about actually being heard and having your suggestions acted upon? From where I sit, I don't see a lot of optimism in that particular department. I'm thinking of an article by a very high-ranking Black physician who's an expert in a certain medical area, and he's writing an article about that medical area, and it has to do with racial justice and kidney transplantation, which is huge because African Americans suffer from a greatly disproportionate volume of end-stage renal disease, which means either you are going to wind up on dialysis, which is not a happy way of life at all, or if you're lucky, you're going to get a kidney transplant that works. That situation has been improving for a variety of reasons. I think there is some real interest on the part of the organizations that distribute organs for transplantation to really work on racial justice. I mean, you can see that in the literature, but it's still not a 100% fair system. And so this is a man, the doctor I'm talking about occupies a very high position at a major university medical establishment. And you read carefully his commentary in the specialty journal, and it becomes clear at a certain point that he is really sort of suppressing rage. This is a highly trained, sophisticated, good writer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But he looks around at the medical landscape that he sees, and he can see who has power, who does not have power. And my feeling is that his feeling is one of anger at a white medical establishment that will not pay sufficient attention to the racial injustices that are there, that you can read about in the peer-reviewed literature, and that of course he sees. But he doesn't, take out an ad in the newspaper. I kind of wish he would. Instead, he is writing in a specialty journal, and he's not being as straightforward as he might. I don't think this is a question of somebody being weak. It's obvious that this is a strong man. I think he's being strategic. And I think a lot of these people have to figure that making a big protest in the context of a white-dominated American medicine may very well be counterproductive. That is my best guess at how these people calculate what they're going to say and how they're going to say it.
And I think you mentioned also that you are working towards a second project talking about some of these issues for current times. Is that correct?
Yeah, on the professional lives of Black doctors, which are complicated and sometimes tormented, have all sorts of issues that most white doctors don't. It's a world that's gotten very little attention.
Okay. We just had another question pop in here to the chat box. Why do you feel that it is so hard for individuals to take accountability that medical racism exists. And why is this topic not seen within medical schools or hospitals? Many books present to medical students only to address how certain diseases are present in white patients, but do not show or prepare medical students on how these diseases would appear for Black patients. Why are these exclusions not addressed by medical schools?
That is a really great question. And I can see if I can keep track of all of its moving parts. But in the case of the colleague's last point, it is only recently, for example, that the world of dermatology has been waking up to the fact that you had better learn to diagnose serious skin diseases in skin that is colored something other than white. Okay. That you had better be able to diagnose a melanoma or this or that. The trouble is that the textbooks have always presented white skin as the normative model of a skin in which dermatological disease occurs. And you can make fatal mistakes if you don't know how to detect skin disorders in skins that are colored something other than white. See, now that, call it an oversight. Well, people died as a result of this oversight. The good news is that for the past few years, this is an area that's been getting attention. And I mean, I know that I have a niece who I think she's a brand new doctor. She's going to be a dermatologist. And apparently she knew about this. She just graduated from medical school. And somebody had the sense to bring, the cross-racial aspect of practicing safe dermatology to her attention. But she is a very, very young doctor. So, I mean, that's one example. The big question, I think, came at the very beginning, and that is, why is it so difficult to institute accountability for the, to make a maximum effort to be sure that medical care is equitable, and then this whole issue of the abuse of personnel that I brought up. Well, institutions, I've read, tend to perpetuate themselves in the forms that they occupy right now. Nobody wants to give up power, because institutional change is about passing power from one person or office to another. What I see in the medical school, in which I have my small role to play, I think that there is a tremendous amount of reluctance to share the stage with people with whom the white doctors who run the place are not very familiar. I don't think their competence at race relations is probably very high, so that they're probably afraid of a greater degree of racial integration. They may well have doubts about the qualifications of Black doctors or medical students or whatever. Then the qualifications to do what? I mean, if it is part of medical competence to be able to deal with a realistic range of patients across ethnicities, then getting the super duper score on your board exam is fine. I wonder how relevant that is to certain other important aspects of practicing medicine. This is a sticky question. I'm reading their minds. Okay, I'm just doing my best to read the minds of the people who who have the power. They tolerated the course I brought to the medical school. Now they have to, because my co-teacher is herself a distinguished African-American physician. So I think they're stuck with us for a while. But they have a long way to go.
Yeah. And, you know, medical racism, social determinants of health, I mean, we don't have enough time to discuss all of it because it's such a deep-rooted issue. Before we transition over to your next book here, I'll ask, would you provide 3 key takeaways about your book, Black and Blue, that you would want the audience to possibly further research on their own that they may find value in?
I would, when you see, I mean, this may be a little technical. I'm doing my best off the top of my head. When you see the term racial health disparities, do not think of it as a phenomenon of nature. It is, to a very large extent, a product of human behavior and human choices, which would be, you know, people running institutions or running research operations that will or will not pay attention to the urgent needs of a certain so-called racial population. You know, one of the standard complaints is that cystic fibrosis, which affects mainly whites, has apparently been much better funded than sickle cell research, which is a much better known disorder, is habitually and mistakenly labeled a black disease, which it is not. It's a disease you're susceptible to if you have ancestors who were exposed to malaria. I mean, that's the fact. So, in other words, don't take the terminology you get from the people in charge all that seriously. Assume that the medical problems of people of color that you can imagine are probably about 25 times worse than you think, because nobody prepared you to take these people and their problems into account. That's another one. Yet another, I guess number 3 would be, you know, doctors are like anybody else. There's wonderful doctors, there are not so wonderful doctors, and then there's everybody in between. Do not assume that, in fact, the odds are against any particular doctor really being a racially sophisticated person, in that this doctor, I'm thinking of white doctors in particular, although it could be non-African American doctors who are not labeled white. As a matter of fact, any doctor, I don't care what ethnicity, color, whatever, any doctor can absorb medical stereotypes in medical school. Anybody. There is it's a high pressure education. There's going to be a lot of conformity just by the nature of the education. Let's say you're a black medical student who is hearing inaccurate things about racial differences from a white doctor teacher. I hear about that stuff. Then there's a question, do you speak up? What kind of a report do you want at the end of the semester written up about you? Honestly, these are the sorts of scenarios that occur in medical schools. And of course, when the person in the subordinate position knows better than the resident physician or whoever is giving the lesson, and that person, for his or her own strategic reasons, decides to say, so, but progress has been impeded. Progress that might have happened didn't happen because there's a certain intimidation factor. So my point number 3 is do not assume that any doctor in particular is a racially competent professional. You just, I'm afraid to say that the evidence suggests otherwise, and that it's very likely that most active doctors have a lot to learn about the humane practice of race relations in the medical setting.
Well said. So let's transition over here to your most recent book, in 2017, Dopers in Uniform. And the description reads, the first assessment of the dimensions and consequences of the felony use of anabolic steroids in major urban police departments. Why did you decide to write this book?
Well, as a matter of fact, to be totally honest, there was a good book on this subject published 2 years earlier, in 2015, by he's now an academic criminologist, but he spent 30 years in the military police. And his co-author is a professional criminologist. And they produced it is not the same as my book. Its range is not as broad. And it doesn't go into nearly as much of the international subcultures of anabolic steroid use and that sort of thing. But these are people who are really close to law enforcement, and they're just fed up with what is allowed to go on. And all right, we'll get back to that. Why did I decide to read this book? Because I've been studying performance-enhancing substances, mostly in sport, for a very long time. And for a very long time, I subscribed to a kind of a news service that reported everything from anywhere about doping, of whatever type, mostly sports doping. I have thousands and thousands of these reports on my computer. And one thing I noticed in 2005 was that suddenly there was, you saw these reports about cops on steroids. And this really kind of came out of the blue. And I said, whoa, this looks significant. And so I collected and collected and collected for years. And eventually there was enough of local newspaper coverage of these cases and a variety of other sources. And so I was able to produce a book. But one of the interesting things about this topic is that the mainstream media won't touch it. And my book, as far as I can tell, was largely ignored. People wouldn't review it. I would contact journalists. No, thank you. I've been contacted by some journalists who say, you wrote a book about this. I'm interested in this. It's a story that doesn't go anywhere. And I don't claim to understand entirely why that is the case. I would assume that somewhere there is an intimidation factor. I think there are people who probably assume that cops are entitled to steroids because they have to get into wrestling matches with suspects on the streets. But what is really disturbing to me and to the military policeman and the criminologist who wrote the other book is that in the United States, in the 18,000 police departments with upwards of 500,000 local police officers, the Anabolic Steroids Control Act is never enforced. If you or theoretically, if you or I were caught possessing anabolic steroids without a legitimate medical prescription, we could be sentenced to 5 years in prison on a felony. Never happens to cops, ever. And my estimate is that there are tens and tens of thousands of American police officers on steroids, that the number has been increasing for years. I hear anecdote after anecdote about this, people just astounded by the size of police officers, or some police officers. So that the police chiefs have basically decided not to intervene. They have basically decided that for 500,000 officers, the commission of this particular felony doesn't matter. And I think it does matter for two reasons. First of all, I think it signals a weakness on the part of police administration. And the second thing is that you are putting psychoactive drugs in the heads of armed people, some of whom join the force because they're aggressive personalities to begin with. And I think police chiefs ought to care about whether an anabolic steroid that has been demonstrated in medical literature to cause irritability and anger and the whole short fuse syndrome. I think it's irresponsible not to even make an effort to control anabolic steroid use in this armed population. Now, what you cannot say is that because Officer A committed this particular violent act, he was on an anabolic steroid. Unless you rushed in with a testing kit, and even there you'd have to be lucky because he might have stopped using a while back. You don't know. But one of the things we've all seen on television over the past several months during the demonstrations and the protests, the violent incidents, et cetera, was police officers just apparently losing their minds and behaving with a kind of violence that just does not make any sense in terms of the standards of, rational, decent civilian policing. My guess, and it's only a guess, my guess is that because there are, in my estimation, so many police officers on steroids, and because chances are that the more aggressive personalities and the ones who want to muscle up will be the people who are more likely to use anabolic steroids, that I assume that there's a very good chance that some of these inexplicably violent episodes may very well have something to do with anabolic steroid use. But we don't know, and that is one of the reasons that it is not covered the way it ought to be, because you need that proverbial smoking gun. You are not going to get an active duty cop to go onto the evening news and say, "Yep, I use anabolic steroids," because that is a public relations disaster for his department, and he's not going to do it.
Right.
And the testing, as far as I can tell, there is no testing. There's no testing. There's no testing that's worth anything. New York did testing for a little while. They gave it up. 2008. Phoenix did testing for a while. They gave it up in 2014. You know why Phoenix gave up testing in 2014?
Mm-mm.
The report from the department was that they were getting so many positive high testosterone results that they couldn't tell whether the stuff was legal or illegal. Now, how's that for an alibi for stopping a steroid testing program? It's completely ridiculous.
Wow.
It tells you something about the lack of appetite for going after steroid use. The police unions would loudly object, because one of the missions of the police union is to absolutely protect their idea of officer privacy, and which includes violent tendencies. It can be very hard to identify the most violent officers in a police department because the secrecy culture is just so strong. And if that is the case, then the anabolic steroid use is absolutely something that the head of the police union would throw a curtain of secrecy over. It's none of your business, you know. There might be a medical issue, and it's not the public's concern whether Officer Smith needs the the androgenic drug for some conceivable medical purpose, et cetera, et cetera. There are those complications. So it's really under the radar.
Yeah. Now, you're not a stranger to controversies, right? So, Darwin's Athletes was a little controversial with some individuals. And with Dopers in Uniform, you said, some journalists, they wouldn't even touch it. They didn't want to review it or anything like that. Did any more controversies come to your doorstep as a result of writing this?
No.
No. Okay.
I didn't know what to expect. There was a part of my brain that was thinking of buying a security system. None of that came to pass. Currently it is a sleeping issue, and it is going to take a very violent, deadly steroid-related incident to break the silence. Now, once upon a time in 2012, a couple of prize-winning journalists did the best possible thing to publicize this story. They got records from a pharmacy in New York that showed that 248 police officers on one New Jersey police force were using anabolic steroids. They had the records from the pharmacy. They broke the story. They won a big prize. The Attorney General of the state of New Jersey was saying, oh, this is terrible. We're going to have to, reform procedures and all this. And there's a whole chapter in the book explaining how all the big shots and the DAs in New Jersey basically put this story to sleep. It was a big, big story. And it won a big prize, but what I call it in the book is the steroid scandal that never left New Jersey. It was bottled up, and it never entered the public conversation on policing. And if you have an issue that is related to police reform, like this one is, and you can't get it into the national conversation, then you are at a disadvantage from the standpoint of providing the most useful, potentially useful information about American policing in relation to this or that. How many people are aware, and this is proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, apparently this is even being taught in the high schools in Chicago, that for 19 years, a Chicago police commander ran a torture chamber on city property for Black suspects. He did. Bags over the head, electricity, 19 years. He went to prison for 4 years, I think it was for perjury. He was never indicted for these terrible crimes. He went into retirement, he got his pension, he died in Florida a couple of years ago. But here's what I think is the big point. You didn't know that. Now, if that isn't a story that ought to enter the public conversation on policing, I don't know what is. But there are some very powerful inhibitions about talking about the police that still operate. It's different in 2020 for some the last X years. I mean, ever since Michael Brown 6 years ago, this has been a pretty hot issue. But it hasn't been hot enough to produce real reforms, and it certainly has not been hot enough to reform the attitudes of a lot of police officers regarding Black people.
Have a question here in the chat box. Police on steroids, the problem, the anabolic steroid problem. United States, America issue, United States of America issue, or is it a global issue?
There are cops on steroids in some other countries. I don't have a lot of information on that. I mean, I know I was in Germany at a meeting a number of years ago. I'm talking with a guy who worked, I think he was a scientist in one of the German police departments. And he said that one of the things that candidates for the SWAT team would do would be to bulk up on steroids before they took their physical to make the German SWAT team. Okay, and so there's, you know, functional use of an anabolic steroid to increase muscle mass and muscle strength for a certain practical purpose. My sense of it is that there is actually relatively little use of anabolic steroids in say other, I mean, societies more or less similar to, you know, Western Europe, for example. I think this is overwhelmingly an American practice. And I think it is tied to the police cause death rate in the United States as, say, compared to Britain, which has maybe a fifth as many people as the United States. We have 320 million. And as of today, there are 3 police-related deaths of civilians happening every day. So you're looking at 1,000 people a year. In Britain, it's more like 25. Total. Demonstrating that there seems to be an awful lot of extra superfluous killing going on. And I think it's cultural. I think it has to do with the ethos of a police department that either decides or does not decide to adopt a military model, shall we say. I think the military, well, it's clear last 20 or 30 years, the military model has really been taking over. And there's a journalist, I think his name is Radley Balco, who has written a book about this. He's the expert on the militarization of American policing. And I would suggest that the more you militarize the mentality of the police force, the more of those guys who are going to want to be on steroids. Not just because of the muscle mass, but because of the attitude.
Right.
There is something like steroidal policing, which has much more to do with attitude and aggressiveness than it does with how much muscle you're packing. It's a real cultural thing. And police departments, like any other institutions, they have cultures. And what any number of police forces in Western Europe demonstrate is that you don't have to use the military model. Now, one of the things that happens in the United States is that some police departments are going to use how they think about African Americans as an excuse to muscle up and to acquire more armaments.
You talked a little bit about, you know, so almost like a fraternity of police that really kind of sweep this under the rug. in your research, do you find that it's the same for let's say white police officers as black police officers?
That is a great question. I don't know too much about this. I have seen a number of recent articles that have come out about the predicament of the black police officer. One just days ago, in some respectable newspaper. And it's clear that at least some of these people are going to feel very torn. I don't have to explain that to you or anybody. It's just so obvious. One thing I do remember from 2016 is that 2016 was a presidential campaign year. And one of the things that happens is that the candidates, in this case, it would have been Trump or Hillary Clinton, they either do or do not solicit endorsements from police unions. I mean, police unions these can be very powerful entities. New York, Chicago, and then you look at some of the people who are at the head of big police unions, like, well, I mean, the guy Catanzara in Chicago is an open T-shirt wearing Trump supporter. Patrick Lynch, the head of the PBA in New York, 35,000 officers, he spoke at the Republican National Convention. So this is just a couple of the many ties between Trump and the police. Now, going back to 2016, every single police union endorsed Trump. Hillary Clinton, rightly or wrongly, did not even bother to seek the endorsement of a single police union. But Trump went up to New England and he says, I'm going to fry every cop killer. And that's all he had to say. It hasn't worked out that way, but Trump will say anything anyway. I think there are a lot of white police officers who identify with Trump as a dynamic, macho character. I can't explain their interest in him any other way. But this is a potentially dangerous relationship. I mean, for example, look at what we hope won't happen in the wake of the November 3rd election. Civil disorder, ballot boxes being burned, just chaos. It's pretty significant what civilian police forces are and are not going to do in that situation if, God forbid, it arises. I'm faintly optimistic it will not happen. I think there's a bluster BS factor to what Donald Trump has to say about that needs to be discounted. But in any case, the professional deportment of 500,000 police officers in the context of a contested election, that's a pretty important factor to consider. Now, I don't know how I got all the way to that, but what was the question?
Yeah, well, I mean, you hit on it. It was the police departments can be considered like a fraternity, right? They're not.
I forgot to tell you the part about the black policeman in Cleveland. What happened? I just did a really long, winding road getting back to actually trying to answer the question. In Cleveland, of course, the white majority police union endorsed Trump. At which point, black cops said, now wait 1 minute. We don't like this at all. What actually happened inside that police department, I cannot tell you. I wish I knew. But something on the order of 12%, I think, something like that. What, 12% of the American police forces are women, and some rather low percentage in that vicinity is African American. I mean, you know, it's like medicine. It's a clear minority. Race relations in police departments must get pretty interesting these days, but I can't claim to know much about it.
Yeah, that's fair. What are your thoughts on the correctional officers? Do you think that steroid use is prevalent in that arena as well?
I keep reading it is, and there's no reason it wouldn't be. Because, you know, it's a potentially dangerous job. So the rationale for steroid use by a policeman, I mean, you know, a reasonable, rational policeman, and you hear this, although you don't hear it very often, because apologies for steroid use on the part of policemen, it's not good public relations. They'll say it off the record, and that is, well, look what I have to put up with on the street. I have to put up with dangerous people. And the other argument is, if I go into a physical conflict, if I see a bunch of guys on the corner and I am really bulked up to the point where it's intimidating, I can stop a fight before it even happens. Okay, so there'll be officers who make that argument, and who knows, maybe that's effective in X number of cases. But I happen to think that because of the psychogenic effects and the disciplinary issue I mentioned earlier, it's on the whole not a good idea at all.
I would agree. This book, Dopers, how do you believe that this particular piece of work for you correlates with some of your earlier writings?
Well, it's about, if you look at performance enhancement as a set of human practices, most of which to date have involved the use of drugs, then cops on steroids is not really much of a deviation from prior practice. There's a tremendous interest in performance enhancing substances, especially, say, since, I don't know, the 90s. And I'm not talking about the athletes have always been interested in effective performance enhancing drugs. But that's not where the market is. The market is the general public. The market is supplementary testosterone for millions of males with prescriptions. 5, 6, whatever million, the last figure I saw, which is not a tremendous number, but the acceptability of, say, in this case, sex hormone supplementation, or the use of Botox for, once upon a time, it was a cosmetic drug. Now it's an anti-migraine drug. It's this, it's that. The erectile dysfunction drugs, Viagra hit in 1998, and that, of course, is another big performance enhancing drug market, if you want to call it that. It's, the mood altering drugs, often for women, have been big ever since the 50s and the 1960s. So there's a whole range of quote unquote performance enhancing substances. And when you look at, say, the police market for anabolic steroids, they're just one slice of the pie. These are men. They're relatively young men in a certain demographic. Older officers might take steroids for other reasons. They're part of a demographic which, as a whole, has been expanding its use of anabolic steroids for a long time. So in that sense, the police officers are participating in a larger development. It's a societal development that attitudes, people's attitudes towards the appropriateness or the inappropriateness of using a so-called performance-enhancing drug evolve over time. And things that were once considered risque are now considered just plain normal. You know, cosmetic surgery used to be a bottom of the barrel medical specialty. Cosmetic surgeons, you know, something more than half a century, they were considered absolutely the bottom of the medical barrel. They were disgraceful. Now they're millionaires. There's a huge, so that people's attitudes towards what you can and cannot do to the human body in order to quote unquote improve it evolve over time. And so that the police story is just one of a whole number of sort of comparable stories, except that, like doctors, they're very special people because they have very special authorities. They are armed in a very special way. And so that, you know, misconduct among, you know, these two professions, say, looks more threatening to the public interest than the misconduct in certain other professions. You know, professors on the rampage, you know, you don't hear about that. We can't do the sort of harm that doctors and police officers can do. So, yeah, there's a whole range to consider.
All right. Lastly here, I just want to ask, what key takeaways do you want the participants in today's discussion to take away from Dopers in Uniform?
That I think there is a real undisciplined aspect to American policing. I mean, I didn't, you know, start off life fearing policemen. You know, I had that advantage among others. And frankly, do I fear the political power of police in the Trump age? Yes, I do. Do I fear the individual police officer? Up to this point, I have had no reason to, but that isn't really the point. So, you know, I did 10, 12 years of research, and I was really struck by the volume of disorder, of lack of discipline, people getting away with things that seemed to me part of the American police culture. And then I think of the latest story from the Boston Globe, it's either today or yesterday, about the Massachusetts state trooper scandal. Just, you know, a whole range of offenses, some of them criminal. And, you know, the solid citizen is going to say, now, wait a minute. You know, how can there be that much dishonesty, lying, cheating, stealing of public funds, covering up of crimes? I mean, is that what the Massachusetts state troopers are about? You know, so that the question is, how much, and this is always the case, how much is there to discover about a major, powerful profession that has historically a basically positive image? I'm talking about the medical world, I'm talking about the police world. Although it is, of course, true that in the last half dozen years or so, the image of American policing has undergone a big transformation because of this tremendous conflict with the African American population, or much of it. So the takeaway is what you see is not what's always there. And that let's not be over credulous about the values and the behaviors of powerful institutions just because, for our own reasons, we've gotten used to thinking of them in relatively positive ways. What if you're presented with contrary evidence? Now, in my case, there is a big African American element at work in my view of the medical profession, and now, along with a lot of other people, with the police profession, that let's take to powerful institutions the skepticism that is warranted. And I'm in a position where I can say I have seen for a long time reasons for being skeptical about the proclamations of powerful white medical people. We're doing all we can. We are interested in serving poor patients and patients of color, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They haven't really demonstrated that. When it comes to the police, I think the word I think of when I think about American policing, and I think in particular about the confrontation with the Black community, is recalcitrance. I think that the police culture, certainly the people at the top of the major police unions, are like Trump in that they have absolutely no intention of giving up 1 inch of territory in the racial conversation. I don't think they're prepared to concede a thing. I think they are used to the race relations situation as it has evolved. And I don't think they have encountered enough pressure to be forced to change. There's a lot of hostility there. And the police, in a way, have joined the ideological war between the Trump side that says there's no such thing as systemic racism, and a lot of other people's perspective, including the vast majority of African Americans. And guess what? There is, and there's plenty of evidence to prove that. This is a really serious political conflict that is going on sort of above our heads. And I'm really looking forward to a post-Trump period in which we may see a different situation, say, in the standoff between the police, the police and Black Americans.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hoberman. I appreciate engaging in this discussion with you. We've come to the point now in the program where any individual may directly interact with Dr. Hoberman. If you had a question in the chat box that we weren't able to get to, now would be an appropriate time to ask. And then we'll follow that question and answers session with closing remarks from our Chief Program Officer, Dr. James Stanson.
And Dr. Hoberman, I'm also going to help Mr. Patrick Rumpf here. As I was going through the chat, I saw some questions in, and as we go back to talking about your medical racism, one of the questions that came through was, do you think the argument Blacks and Hispanics work essential jobs during COVID-19, and that is why they have higher numbers or higher incidence of disease? Is that an example of society trying to turn a blind eye to racism in the medical field?
Well, I mean, the questioner is absolutely right that uh, the greatly disproportionate overexposure of working class Black and Hispanic people. Well, what was the strategy? The strategy was to say they're essential workers. And as soon as you call somebody an essential worker, and you know, in a way, the same applies to the medical people who were risking their lives in what were probably even more dangerous circumstances. As soon as you call somebody an essential worker, you're saying, you know, that's it. You have an obligation to society to risk your life in order to make sure that people continue to be fed, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the COVID-19 crisis, as I said hours ago, brought a lot of attention to the whole issue of racially inequitable medical conditions in the United States that, you know, from a certain angles you can call medical racism. I think what most people would say in terms of the employment patterns that endangered very large numbers of people, basically working class people whose medical access is probably going to be inferior to that of a lot of other people, people whose medical insurance status is probably going to be insufficient in many, many cases. I think that's what they call structural racism. In other words, the employment market in the society is built in such a way that in these circumstances, huge numbers of really vulnerable people, medical access, insurance, exposure to the public, are going to suffer. I think that's, yeah, that has clearly been a big factor.
I've got a question here for you, Dr. Hoberman. Great job today. I've been enjoying listening to you talk and all these great questions that we're getting from everyone in attendance. I have a question here about the Tuskegee syphilis study, talking about kind of going back to Black and Blue a little bit. Are there any similar events that you know of or that you can think of that maybe affected Mexican or Latinx communities in the same way? And maybe explain Tuskegee syphilis study for those maybe who aren't familiar with it.
Well, unfortunately, the so-called Tuskegee syphilis experiment that was run by the U.S. Public Health Service between 1932 and 1972, when a journalist blew the whistle on them, that was the deeply, medically unethical exploitation of several hundred really poor Black sharecroppers in Alabama. That's what that was. And when that was revealed, and that the US government had been running this, that was a huge publicity explosion in this country in 1972. And one of the effects, and there's a literature on this, was to deepen the mistrust of many African Americans regarding American medicine. I think the mistake that a lot of people make when evaluating Tuskegee is, I think a lot of people will say, oh, I know why there's such massive mistrust of the medical establishment among African Americans. It was Tuskegee. I don't think that's the right answer. I think the right answer is generations and generations of suffering and mistreatment, so that there are going to be God knows how many Black families who probably pass down the legacy of their sufferings at the hands of, or at through the neglect of white doctors. Yes, Tuskegee was an enormous publicity event. And did it increase doctor avoidance among African Americans? I'm sure it did. But the trick is not to lose sight of the bigger picture, that reducing medical racism in the United States to the Tuskegee scandal, I think is a big mistake, because the medical racism that matters much, much more is 365 days a year, year after year after year.
Thank you. Justin, did you want to ask your question about medical institutions? I see you have one in the chat as well. You're on mute, Justin.
There we go. Dr. Hoberman, one question that I actually asked was, with a lot of the institutions now, they've created this thing called an Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Do you think that programs similar to yours on medical racism, do you think that that's going to be something that's going to be included in the future of medical education, or do you still think that we have a long way to go?
Well, it seems as though offices of diversity inclusion are multiplying and multiplying, because the anti-racism wave of 2020 is making it happen. The problem with offices of diversity and inclusion, in my opinion, it's really a question, and that is, what are they there for and what can they accomplish? Now, I have a certain memory I'll share with you, and that is, 20 years ago, I went to a medical school in Texas to give a talk. And I had a meeting with the African-American doctor who was their Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And my memory of that doctor is that was one unhappy person. And I think the reason he was an unhappy person, my sense of it, for what it was worth, was that he had been put in an impossible position. That it was 20 years ago, which in a certain sense matters. I don't think that, I think he was there as window dressing. I'll just put it that way. Now, here at the University of Texas at Austin, we have quite an active Office for Diversity and Inclusion. It's, you know, I've probably met the head of it. I don't know much about its operations. I get their emails all the time. I'm not saying anything critical of that office. It may very well be that they are doing better than most. I don't know. What I do know is that observing American institutions, such as educational institutions and medical institutions, for a long time has taught me a certain amount of skepticism about offices like that. And we all know that there are many, many American institutions, including many corporations, say, who are going to hire diversity people because they feel they simply have no choice. That one of the things, I mean, it's almost unseemly, the number of institutions that have been jumping aboard the anti-racism train. I mean, people are stumbling over each other. I'm not saying that, you know, participating in the anti-racism move of 2020 that's not a bad thing. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying what you and I both know, and that is, you really have to wonder about the depth of the commitment. You have to assess some accountability. You know, where show me some results. Don't just show me the emails in your handsome flyers and pamphlets and speeches. Show me something tangible.
Dr. Hoberman, we appreciate everything you've done and said. And this is Tony Garrett. I had a question, and it goes back to your Black and Blue book. You spoke about accountability on a high level. So my question is, in your opinion, is the current COVID pandemic an opportunity to address the disparity of African Americans being affected by challenging medical racism, in a sense that there's an opportunity to challenge the accepted values in the medical profession? Do you think that there's an opportunity that can be seized at this point?
Yes, up to a point, and I may have brought that up actually a few hours ago, whenever, that I think what I said was that the COVID tragedy has focused public attention on the, shall we say, disadvantaged medical status of African Americans, and in this case, Hispanics, in a dramatic way that has not really happened previously. And so from the standpoint of just sheer publicity, public attention being paid to the disproportionate medical suffering of people of color, yeah, I think COVID-19 is a certain kind of opportunity. The accountability thing, however, I think is complicated in this context, because what you've got is this huge, overwhelming emergency, and what is being done to counter it is, vaccine development, trying to get people to wear masks. It's all this sort of, public policy and scientific policy action on a large scale. You're not going to point, except for Trump, you can't really point to one person and say, look at the damage you've done, except, of course, in the case of Trump. That's not going to get you very far. As far as holding medical people in the institutions responsible for not having done what they should have done, I think in the COVID context, that's much more difficult. I think that's a lot more practical if you say, okay, the sad fact is that the Black maternal mortality rate in Texas is through the roof. It's like twice of the rest of the country, which is bad enough, which is like 3 times higher than it is, 2 or 3 times higher than it is for white women. And then you say, what are you going to do about it? You say, what are you going to do about it to powerful people? Now, I heard at our med school class the other night, I heard a very interesting African-American obstetrician talking about this. So we know what he's doing. We know what he is doing patient by patient by patient. The people we don't hear from are policy people or head of medical school people or heads of philanthropic organizations or whatever. Show me a plan. Hire the people who can figure out what might be done on a collective scale, not just one good doctor after the next taking care of his or her patients. That, of course, is essential. But there are people around who could figure out public policy that would address this particular death rate, disproportionate death rate. Complicated, you bet. But what I don't see from the medical establishment is this sort of effort regarding any of the major medical inequities, injustices, call it what you will, with which the African American population is dealing. I think there's a big political will factor that hasn't been activated yet.
All right. I think he kind of answered your question there, Tony.
I tried.
All right. Pat, we're getting close to 6 p.m. here.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you for your final remarks and to go ahead and close us out.
Okay. Yeah, my name is James Stamps. I'm the Chief Program Officer and the founder of Intellect U Well. Thank you all for participating in our talk today, and especially thanks to you, Dr. Hoberman. There's a great, lively discussion on some great books. And if you haven't had a chance to read these books or anything like that, hopefully you're more interested in them now, and you can pick them up through any of your digital or online book sellers, Amazon or Barnes and Noble, or any place that you get books. And I guess, Professor Hoberman, I had one more question here for you. You told us about you're working on something else with medical racism. Is there any other topics or anything that you want to share with us that you're working on, or anything you want to point us towards online or anywhere if people want to find out more information about you or read something that you're working on now?
I'm very busy with what I described to you. Yeah, there's my hands, James, my hands are full.
And you're teaching as well, just like us on Zoom. If people wanted to reach out to you, are you okay if they send you an email message or anything like that? Some people I know we had some students, some pre-med and medical students who were on the call earlier who asked you some questions. Can they email you? Is that okay?
I look forward to hearing from any or all of them, especially young people interested in medicine.
Great, absolutely. I recognize some folk from my university, Prairie View A&M, who were on the line earlier. So I know a couple of those questions came from them. You probably could tell they were from people interested in medicine. Okay, well, this is going to be wrap us up here. This is our first of these Intellect U Well Journeys that was online on Zoom. And so I think it went pretty well. We're going to have another one in April, depends on kind of how COVID goes. It may be on Zoom or it may be face-to-face. Our face-to-face location is Geidt Gallery, which is in Texas Southern University in the 3rd Ward of Houston. Professor Hoberman, if things are going better, we'd love for you to come in and hang out with us in person. Otherwise, we could pipe you in if you want to participate in that conference as well.
Well, I drove in and saw you before the pandemic, and I'm happy to do it after the pandemic. Absolutely.
We would love to see you. Anytime you want to come to Houston, you can come check us out, Dr. Hoberman. You know you have a friend in Intellect U Well and 100 Black Men of Metropolitan Houston. All right. So we're going to end here at 6:01. Does anyone have any final thoughts or questions? I'd like to also give a shout out to our moderator for today. Y'all want to turn your mics on? We can give him a hand in so you can hear it, right? Pat Rumpf, our Vice President for Operations.
Happy to do it. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right. Great job, Pat. All right. And so look out for future events from Intellect U Well. Like I said, we're going to have Intellect U Well Journeys in the spring. We also have Nature by the Book, collaboration with Outdoor Afro. So we're going to be doing book talks on books that relate to nature and outdoors. So take a look for that as well. And I'd like to thank everybody who came and participated, those who left the call early for different reasons, and those who are still here. I said we have John, different John. I have John with the nice beard there. We've got, of course, the king of Carytown, Matthew Sedita. We got Skip Rosen. We've got Tori Watson, who's also a Prairie View A&M student that I know of, and Peter Hess. And Rachel, I think I see. All of you all, thank you for participating in our event today. And we will see you all soon. All our events are all going to be available on Eventbrite. And we're going to have this recorded. We'll put it on our YouTube page as well. We have a LinkedIn page and a Facebook page. And we'll have a YouTube page, and we'll put this event up there as well. So you can go back and watch the whole thing if you missed any part of it. All right. Tanya, would you like to take us out? Anything you want to say before we go as our communications person? How did I do? Did I do okay?
You did a great job. Thank you again to everyone for attending today, and I hope you really enjoyed it and learned about some topics that you can discover on your own and maybe do some additional research.
All right, and I want to say thank you to everyone too.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Hoberman. I see a hand there from Peter Hess. I think that's for you, Dr. Hoberman. All right. Take care, everyone. We're going to end it here. Have a wonderful rest of your week here, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
All right. All right. Guess we can end the recording here. Justin?